The morning I found Karen Henderson standing in my driveway at 6:47 a.m., clutching a clipboard and wearing the kind of smug smile that makes your coffee taste bitter, I knew my peaceful retirement was about to become a war zone. What I didn't know was that by the end of the story, she'd be staring at a 12-foot wall of chicken wire and lumber where her $1 million Lakeview used to be. Let me back up 6 months. My name is Tom, and after 32 years of managing construction crews in Detroit, I'd finally bought my dream property, 4 acres of rolling hills in Lakewood Estates, a gated community 40 minutes outside the city. The house was modest, a 1,980s ranch with good bones, but the real prize was the land. Mature oak trees dotted the property like nature's sculptures, and the back acres sloped down toward Crystal Lake, where morning mist danced across the water like ghosts. I'd always planned to raise chickens in retirement. My grandfather had kept a flock back in Tennessee, and some of my happiest childhood memories were collecting warm eggs at dawn, the hens clucking contentedly as they pecked at scattered corn. So 3 months after moving in, I drove to Thompson's Farm Supply and came home with 12 Rhode Island red chicks, their tiny peeps filling my truck cab with the promise of fresh eggs and simple pleasures. The co-op I built was practical but charming, a 6x8 shed painted barn red with white trim, surrounded by a modest 20x30 run enclosed in standard chicken wire. I positioned it on the eastern edge of my property, far enough from the house to avoid any smell issues, but close enough that I could enjoy watching the birds scratch and peck from my kitchen window. For 3 blissful months, life was exactly what I dreamed of. I'd wake at sunrise, pull on my work boots, and trudge out to the co-op with a coffee mug in one hand and a container of feed in the other. The hens would rush to greet me, their red feathers catching the morning light like burnished copper. Big Bertha, my prize hen, would always be first to the gate, her head cocked at that curious angle chickens manage so perfectly. The eggs were incredible deep orange yolks that stood up proud in the pan, shells so strong you had to give them a firm crack to break them. I started giving dozens away to neighbors, dropping off cartons with little notes, fresh from the Henderson Ranch. Mr. Peterson next door was particularly grateful, mentioning how his wife's arthritis had been acting up and the walk to the grocery store was getting harder. But paradise, as I've learned, always has a serpent. And in Lakewood Estates, her name was Karen Henderson. Karen lived in the McMansion directly behind my property, a gaudy monument to excess with more square footage than taste. Her house sat on a slight rise, giving her what she considered the best lake view in the subdivision. From her master bedroom balcony, she could see across my back acre to the shimmering water beyond. It was a view that had undoubtedly added $50,000 to her home's value, and she'd mentioned it to anyone within earshot at neighborhood gatherings. The first time we'd met, at the annual HOA barbecue last summer, she'd cornered me by the potato salad and spent 20 minutes detailing her home's features. The realtor said, "I have the most desirable lot in Phase 2, she'd gushed, her manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. The lake view from my master suite is absolutely pristine, not a single obstruction. It's like having a private resort right in my backyard." I'd nodded politely and changed the subject to something safer, like the weather. But apparently, my innocent chicken coop had registered as the obstruction in Karen's perfectly ordered world. And that Tuesday morning in early October, she decided to do something about it. I was refilling the water containers when I heard the click of high heels on my gravel driveway. Karen appeared around the corner of my house, looking like she was dressed for a real estate showing rather than a neighborhood visit. Her blonde hair was pulled into the kind of tight bun that suggested serious business, and she carried that clipboard like a weapon. "Good morning, Tom," she called out, in a voice that managed to sound both sweet and venomous. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by so early, but I wanted to discuss a small concern with you before it becomes a bigger issue." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans. The hens sensed the tension and clustered near the fence, their beady eyes fixed on this new intruder. Big Bertha let out a low growl. Yes, chickens can growl that perfectly captured my own feelings. "Morning, Karen. What's on your mind?" She approached the chicken run with the kind of careful steps someone might use when approaching a crime scene. Her nose wrinkled slightly as she surveyed my setup, and I could practically see her cataloging violations in her head. "Well, I've been reviewing our HOA covenants," she began, flipping through the papers on her clipboard, "and I'm afraid there might be some issues with your current livestock situation." Livestock situation? I had to give her credit for creativity. "These are just chickens, Karen. 12 hens. They're quieter than most dogs." She pursed her lips. "Be that as it may, Section 4.7 of our community guidelines clearly states that no livestock, poultry, or farm animals shall be kept on any residential lot within Lakewood Estate." She held up the clipboard as if it were the 10 Commandments. "I'm sure this was just an oversight on your part, but we'll need to remedy this situation as soon as possible." I felt my jaw tighten. I read those covenants before I bought the house. That section refers to commercial livestock operations. These are pets that happen to lay eggs. Pets. Karen's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tom, please? These are farm animals, plain and simple. And frankly, they're becoming quite the eyesore. The smell, the noise, the rustic appearance of that structure." She gestured dismissively at my carefully built coop. "It's really not in keeping with the aesthetic we've worked so hard to maintain in our community." That's when Big Bertha decided to voice her opinion, letting out a loud, indignant squawk that seemed to echo Karen's tone perfectly. Several of the other hens joined in, creating a cacophony of protests that would have been comical if I weren't so annoyed. Karen stepped back as if she'd been attacked. "You see? This is exactly what I mean. These creatures are disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of our neighborhood." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "Karen, I've lived here 3 months, and you're the first person to complain. In fact, most folks seem to appreciate the fresh eggs." "Well, I'm not most folks." Her chin lifted in that imperious way that marked her as someone accustomed to getting her way. "I'm the current president of the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association, and it's my responsibility to ensure our community standards are maintained. You have 30 days to remove these animals and that unsightly structure." She tore a pink sheet from her clipboard and handed it to me. "This is your official violation notice. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Tom. We're all trying to preserve our property values here." With that, she turned on her designer heel and click-clacked back down my driveway, leaving me standing there with a piece of paper that might as well have been a declaration of war. But what Karen didn't know was that I'd spent 3 decades dealing with building inspectors, city planners, and bureaucrats who thought they could push around the little guy. And she definitely didn't know that I'd already started researching the legal precedents for keeping chickens in residential communities. That evening, I spread the HOA covenants across my kitchen table like a general planning a campaign. The violation notice sat beside my coffee mug, its pink paper seemingly mocking me with every sip. But after 2 hours of reading through the dense legal language, I found what I was looking for. Section 4.7 did indeed prohibit livestock and farm animals. But Section 2.3 specifically allowed for domestic pets and companion animals, subject to reasonable restrictions regarding noise and sanitation. The key word was domestic. And according to a 2018 Michigan court ruling I'd found online, chickens kept for personal egg production, not commercial purposes, fell under the definition of domestic animals in most residential contexts. More importantly, The covenants required the HOA to provide reasonable accommodation for residents' legitimate use of their property, as long as it didn't create a genuine nuisance. My 12 quiet hens, producing eggs for personal use and neighborhood sharing, hardly qualified as a nuisance. I had grounds to fight this. The question was whether I wanted to. The answer came the next morning when I found Karen standing by my mailbox, arms crossed, staring at my chicken coop with the kind of disdain usually reserved for roadkill. "Morning, Karen," I called out as I emerged from the house with my coffee and feed bucket. "You're up early again." She didn't return the greeting. "I wanted to see if you'd started making arrangements to remove those birds." "Actually, I've been reading our HOA documents more carefully." I set the feed bucket down and pulled the folded covenants from my back pocket. Turns out there's some ambiguity about what constitutes domestic animals versus livestock. Her eyes narrowed. "There's no ambiguity, Tom. Chickens are farm animals. End of discussion." Well, the Michigan Court of Appeals might disagree with you. Morrison versus Westfield, HOA 2018. Judge ruled that chickens kept for personal use are domestic animals under most residential covenants. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression hardened into something approaching fury. "Are you threatening to sue the HOA? I'm suggesting we might want to reconsider this violation before it becomes a legal issue. Neither of us wants to deal with it." She stepped closer, and I caught the overpowering scent of her perfume, something expensive and cloying that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. "Let me be very clear, Tom. I don't care what some judge in another county decided about someone else's chickens. This is Lakewood Estates, and I've been keeping property values up and undesirable elements out for 8 years. These birds are going one way or another." Undesirable elements? I felt my temperature rising. "Karen, they're chickens. They lay eggs. They eat bugs. They mind their own business, which is more than I can say for some folks around here." Her cheeks flushed red, clashing terribly with her orange foundation. "Don't you dare speak to me like that. I'm trying to protect this community from turning into some rural slum. Do you want our neighborhood to look like a barnyard? Do you want the smell of chicken droppings drifting over our backyard parties? Do you want the sound of roosters waking up our children at dawn?" "I don't have any roosters," I pointed out. "Just hens. And they're quieter than Mrs. Patterson's toy poodle." "That's not the point." Her voice was getting shrill, and I noticed several neighbors had come out to water their flowers or retrieve their newspapers' activities that suspiciously coincided with our increasingly heated conversation. "The point is that you're violating our community standards, and I won't allow it. 30 days, Tom. Remove the chickens, or we'll take legal action." She spun around and marched back toward her house, her heels clicking out an angry staccato on the pavement. But just before she reached her driveway, she turned back. "And by the way, I've already contacted the township about potential zoning violations. Turns out, residential properties aren't automatically zoned for agricultural use, even small-scale operations." My blood ran cold. If the township sided with her interpretation, I could be facing municipal fines on top of HOA penalties. Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds as she watched the realization dawn on my face. But she wasn't done yet. "Oh, and Tom? I'll be attending the next HOA board meeting to formally request an emergency vote on enhanced livestock restrictions. I think you'll find that most of our neighbors value peace and property values over agricultural nostalgia." As she disappeared into her McMansion, I stood there, realizing that this was no longer about chickens. This was about control, power, and Karen's pathological need to micromanage every aspect of our neighborhood. She'd turned my simple retirement dream into a battleground, and she clearly thought she held all the advantages. What she didn't know was that I'd spent my entire career fighting battles against petty bureaucrats and power-hungry officials who thought they could intimidate working folks into submission. And I'd never lost one yet. The next few days taught me something valuable about suburban warfare. Information is power, and Karen had been hoarding both for years. My first stop was Mike Peterson's house next door. Mike was a retired electrician with calloused hands and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from fixing other people's problems for 40 years. His wife Martha had been one of my most grateful egg recipients, always asking about Big Bertha by name and sharing stories about her own grandmother's chickens back in Ohio. I found Mike in his garage, tinkering with an old Craftsman lawnmower that had seen better decades. The familiar smell of motor oil and WD-40 hit me like a nostalgic wave. It reminded me of my father's workshop, where everything had a purpose and nothing was wasted. "Heard you had a visit from the neighborhood enforcer," Mike said, without looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning. Martha saw the whole thing from the kitchen window. Said Karen looked like she was ready to call in an airstrike. "She's threatening to get the township involved," I said, settling onto a paint-splattered stool. "Claims I'm running an illegal agricultural operation." Mike snorted. "Agricultural operation? You've got 12 chickens, Tom. I've seen backyard garden sheds bigger than your coop. Tell that to Karen. She's calling an emergency HOA meeting to vote on new livestock restrictions." Now, Mike looked up, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Emergency meeting? That woman's got more emergency meetings than a fire department. Last year, she called one because the Johnsons painted their mailbox post the wrong shade of black." Wrong shade of black. Midnight black instead of charcoal black. 2-hour meeting, complete with color swatches and threats of legal action. He wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Thing is, Tom, Karen's got 3 guaranteed votes on that 5-person board. Her best friend Julie Morrison, who'd vote to ban breathing if Karen suggested it. Bob Chen, who's terrified of confrontation and just agrees with whoever talks loudest. And herself, of course. What about the other 2? Frank Williams and Susan Davis. Frank's usually reasonable, but he travels a lot for work and misses half the meetings. Susan's tough. She's a retired teacher and doesn't take crap from anyone. But that still leaves Karen with a majority if Frank's not there." The math was discouraging, but Mike wasn't done. "Here's the thing, though. Karen's been pushing her luck lately. The new fence height restrictions that nobody asked for. The ban on garden gnomes, and I mean, who doesn't love garden gnomes? The requirement that all outdoor Christmas decorations be removed by January 2 end, which made Mrs. Chen cry because she's Orthodox and celebrates later." He leaned against his workbench, crossing his arms. "Point is, folks are getting tired of her little power trips. But they're also scared of her. Karen's got a lawyer friend who sends scary letters for free, and she's not shy about using that particular resource." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you might have more support than you think, but people need to know they're not alone in standing up to her. This chicken thing might just be the catalyst folks have been waiting for." That afternoon, I took Mike's advice and started making the rounds. Armed with a basket of fresh eggs and what I hoped was a neighborly smile, I visited every house within a 3-block radius of my property. The results were illuminating. At the Morrison house, no relation to Julie, thankfully, elderly Mrs. Morrison invited me in for coffee and spent an hour telling me about the chickens her family had kept during the Depression. "Smartest birds you ever saw," she said, her eyes bright with memory. "Could spot a hawk from half a mile away and sound the alarm for the whole flock." She took a dozen eggs and promised to attend the emergency meeting. The Hendersons? Yes, there were 2 Henderson families in Lakewood Estates, which had caused years of male confusion, were farmers' kids from Iowa. "Nothing wrong with chickens," said Jack Henderson, a burly man with soil permanently embedded under his fingernails. Hell of a lot quieter than the Yamaha motorcycle Karen's son rides up and down the street every weekend. At the Chen house, I learned that Bob Chen's wife Linda was actually a veterinarian who specialized in small animals and poultry. "Your setup looks professional," she said, after walking over to examine my coop. "Better ventilation than most commercial operations I've seen. These birds are clearly healthy and well cared for." But the real revelation came at the Williams house, where Frank's wife Carol was home even though Frank was traveling. "Can I speak confidentially?" she asked after accepting a carton of eggs and praising their rich color. "Of course. Karen's been trying to force us to cut down our oak tree for 2 years. Says it drops leaves on her property and blocks her western light. She's threatened us with everything from nuisance lawsuits to township complaints, but we've held firm. That tree was here before her house, and it'll be here long after she's gone." Carol glanced around, as if Karen might be hiding in the bushes with a recording device. "The thing is, she's gotten progressively more aggressive about it. Last month, she actually had someone come out and spray paint mark property lines, trying to prove the tree was over the boundary. Cost us $1,500 to have a professional surveyor prove her wrong." "What does this have to do with my chickens?" "Everything. Karen doesn't really care about HOA covenants or community standards. She cares about control, and she's figured out that threatening legal action makes most people cave rather than fight. But if enough people stand up to her at once." She let the sentence hang there, but I understood the implication. By the time I'd finished my rounds, I had a clearer picture of the battlefield. Karen had been waging a quiet reign of terror for years, using the HOA as her personal enforcement arm to micromanage every aspect of neighborhood life. But she'd also created a growing reservoir of resentment among residents who were tired of walking on eggshells around their own homes. The question was whether that resentment could be channeled into actual resistance when the moment came. I got my answer the next evening when my doorbell rang at 8:30. I opened it to find Mike Peterson, Carol Williams, and Linda Chen standing on my porch, along with 3 other neighbors I'd visited that afternoon. "We've been talking," Mike said, "about Karen, about the chickens, about a lot of things, actually." And I stepped aside to let them in. "And we think it's time someone stood up to her," said Carol. "The question is, are you willing to fight this thing all the way, even if it gets ugly?" I looked around at their faces, neighbors who'd become allies, people who were tired of being bullied in their own community. Outside, I could hear my hens settling in for the night, their soft clucks and rustling feathers, a peaceful counterpoint to the tension in my living room. "Let me ask you something," I said. "What do you think Karen would do if she knew we were all meeting here tonight?" The smiles that spread across their faces told me everything I needed to know. But none of us realized that Karen had already made her next move, one that would escalate this conflict far beyond anything we'd imagined. I should have known Karen wouldn't wait for the HOA meeting to make her next move. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered not by our usual postal carrier, but by a courier service that required my signature and left me standing in my bathrobe with an official-looking envelope marked URGENT LEGABL. Inside was 3 pages of dense legalese from Blackstone and Associates, attorney at law, informing me that I was in violation of not only HOA covenants, but also township zoning regulations, state agricultural codes, and something called the Michigan Residential Noise Ordinance. The letter demanded immediate removal of all poultry, dismantling of the unauthorized agricultural structure, and restoration of the property to its original residential condition. The kicker was the timeline: 72 hours or face potential fines of up to $500 per day, plus legal fees and court costs. I was still reading when my phone buzzed with a text from Mike Peterson. "You need to see this." Karen's Facebook page, now. I'd never been much for social media, But I managed to find the Lakewood Estates community group page, where Karen had posted what could only be described as a manifesto. The post, complete with professional photos of my chicken coop taken from multiple angles, read like a prosecutor's opening statement. Neighbors, I'm sure many of you have noticed the LIVESTOCK why that has been constructed illegally on Henderson Lane. After extensive research and consultation with legal experts, I've determined that this operation violates multiple local ordinances and threatens our community's property values, safety, and quality of life. The noise from these animals begins before sunrise and continues throughout the day. The smell is becoming noticeable from several houses away. The structure itself is an unsightly addition that completely destroys the aesthetic we've worked so hard to maintain. More concerning are the health risks. Poultry operations attract rodents, insects, and predators. They can harbor dangerous bacteria like Salmonella and E. coli. They pose risks to our children and pets. I've taken the necessary legal steps to address this situation, but I wanted to keep everyone informed about the lengths some people will go to in order to circumvent our community standards. Please remember that these standards exist for ALL of us, and they're only effective if we ALL respect them. Property values in Lakewood Estates have increased 23% over the past 5 years, precisely because we maintain high standards. Let's not let one person's selfish choices undermine everyone else's investment. The emergency HOA meeting is scheduled for this Saturday at 2 p.m. in the community center. I encourage all residents to attend and voice their concerns about this ongoing violation. Together, we can preserve the community we've all worked so hard to build. The post had been up for less than 2 hours and already had 37 comments, ranging from supportive "thank you for protecting our neighborhood" to confused, "aren't they just chickens?" to outright hostile, "Karen needs to mind her own business for once." But what caught my attention wasn't the comments, it was the photos. Karen hadn't just walked by and snapped a few casual shots. These were professional quality images taken from multiple angles, including several that could only have been shot from her second-story bedroom window with a telephoto lens. She'd been documenting my chicken operation like a private investigator building a case. That's when I realized this wasn't just about chickens or HOA covenants or even neighborhood politics. Karen had turned this into a full-scale propaganda war, complete with legal threats, social media campaigns, and what amounted to surveillance of my property. Two could play that game. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. First to a lawyer friend from my construction days who specialized in property disputes. Then to the township zoning office to request copies of all relevant ordinances. Finally, to a private investigator I'd used years ago to track down a contractor who'd skipped town with a client's deposit money. By afternoon, I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with. The good news, my lawyer confirmed, that the zoning complaint was bogus. Residential properties in our township were specifically allowed to keep up to 25 chickens for personal use, as long as they were kept at least 50 feet from neighboring structures. My coop was 73 feet from the nearest house. The bad news, Karen's lawyer, was technically correct about some of the finer points of HOA enforcement. Even if my chickens were legally allowed by township standards, the HOA could still impose additional restrictions through community covenants. And she had precedent on her side. 3 other Michigan communities had successfully banned backyard chickens through similar HOA actions. The interesting news, my investigator had found some intriguing information about Karen's own compliance with community standards. Apparently, the 6-foot privacy fence around her pool exceeded HOA height limits by 18 inches. The decorative fountain in her front yard required a special permit she'd never obtained. And the satellite dish mounted on her roof violated the community's visual pollution restrictions. Thing is, my investigator explained over the phone. She's been getting away with it because nobody's ever formally complained. HOAs are complaint-driven systems. No complaint, no violation. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if someone were to file formal complaints about these issues, the HOA would be legally obligated to investigate and potentially take enforcement action, especially if the complaints came from multiple residents and were accompanied by photographic evidence. I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. You'd be amazed how quickly people become reasonable when they realize their own vulnerabilities. That evening, armed with a telephoto lens borrowed from Carol Williams's photography enthusiast daughter, I took a leisurely walk around the neighborhood. By the time I returned home, I had comprehensive documentation of not only Karen's violations, but several others throughout the community: oversized mailbox decorations, unauthorized garden lighting, fence height violations, and at least one clearly unpermitted deck extension. But as I uploaded the photos to my computer, I realized I was falling into the same trap that had consumed Karen, turning a simple neighborly disagreement into a bitter campaign of mutual destruction. This wasn't the retirement I'd envisioned, and it certainly wasn't the community I wanted to live in. There had to be a better way. That's when inspiration struck, arriving in the form of a memory from my construction days. I'd once worked on a project where two property owners had gotten into a vicious dispute over sightlines and property values. The solution hadn't been legal threats or escalating violations. It had been creative architecture that gave both parties what they wanted while making the problem disappear entirely. I opened my laptop and began sketching out plans for something Karen had never anticipated: a structure that would technically comply with every HOA regulation while making her regret the day she decided to wage war on my chickens. But first, I had a Facebook post of my own to write. And unlike Karen's manifesto, mine would be short, sweet, and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. Hi, neighbors. I wanted to address some recent concerns about my backyard chickens. I understand that change can be unsettling, and I appreciate everyone's patience as we work through this together. For those interested, I'll be hosting an informal Meet the Chickens gathering this Friday at 6 p.m. Come by for fresh coffee, homemade cookies, and a chance to see what all the fuss is about. I think you'll find that Big Bertha and her sisters are quite the characters. See you then? Tom. I posted it and then sat back to wait. Within minutes, the responses started rolling in: neighbors accepting the invitation, expressing support, and sharing their own positive experiences with my eggs. The tone was completely different from Karen's post: warm, inclusive, and focused on bringing people together rather than driving them apart. But I knew Karen wouldn't let this stand. She'd respond, and when she did, she'd probably overplay her hand in exactly the way I was hoping for. I didn't have to wait long. Her comment appeared 20 minutes later. How convenient that Tom is trying to win people over with food and charm after receiving legal notice of his violations. This is exactly the kind of manipulation tactics we need to be wary of. Don't let cookies and coffee distract you from the real issues: property values, community standards, and legal compliance. Some things are more important than popularity contests. Perfect. Karen had just positioned herself as the neighborhood killjoy who was opposed to cookies, coffee, and community gatherings. Meanwhile, I'd come across as the friendly neighbor trying to address concerns through dialogue and transparency. But what Karen didn't know was that Friday's gathering was just the opening move in a much larger strategy. By the time I was finished, she'd have far bigger problems than a few chickens blocking her precious lake view. Friday evening arrived with the kind of perfect October weather that makes Michigan autumns legendary. The air was crisp, but not cold, and the oak trees were putting on their annual show of gold and crimson. I'd spent the afternoon setting up folding chairs around my backyard, hanging string lights between the trees, and preparing what I hoped would be enough coffee and cookies to feed half the neighborhood. By 5:45, people were already arriving. Mike and Martha Peterson came early to help set up additional seating. Carol Williams brought her famous apple cider and a thermos hot enough to warm hands and hearts. Linda Chen arrived with her veterinarian's bag and offered to answer any health-related questions about backyard poultry. What surprised me was the turnout. By 6:15, I counted 37 neighbors scattered around my backyard, ranging from young families with curious toddlers to elderly couples who'd walked over with their evening coffee cups. Even some folks from the streets beyond my immediate area had shown up, apparently drawn by word of mouth and genuine curiosity about the chickens that had caused such controversy. The stars of the evening, of course, were my 12 hens. Big Bertha rose to the occasion like the natural entertainer she was, strutting around the run with the confidence of a celebrity making personal appearances. The children were enchanted, pressing their faces against the chicken wire and giggling as the hens pecked at their fingers through the mesh. "They're so much quieter than I expected," said Janet Morrison, the elderly woman who'd shared Depression-era chicken stories with me earlier in the week. "And cleaner, too. I was expecting, well, you know how people talk about farm smells. That's because Tom takes excellent care of them," Linda Chen interjected, slipping easily into her professional role. "Proper ventilation, regular cleaning, appropriate feed, this is actually a model setup for backyard poultry." I watched as neighbors who'd never spoken to each other before found themselves bonding over chicken watching. The Johnsons' 8-year-old son was getting an impromptu lesson in egg formation from Mrs. Patterson, while 2 teenagers discovered they could make the hens dance by tossing scratch grains in different patterns. The informal education was exactly what I'd hoped for. These weren't dangerous farm animals or nuisance livestock. They were individual personalities with quirks and behaviors as distinctive as any household pet. Once people saw them up close, the abstract fears about noise and smell and property values became much harder to maintain. "I have to admit," said Bob Chen, the HOA board member who usually sided with Karen, "I was expecting something much more industrial. This is more like a backyard aviary." "That's because it essentially is," I replied, refilling his coffee cup. "These girls are pets that happen to provide breakfast. No different from keeping parakeets, except more useful." Bob chuckled, and I caught him surreptitiously taking photos with his phone, not for evidence, but apparently to show his grandchildren. As the evening progressed, the conversation naturally shifted from chickens to broader neighborhood topics. People shared stories about other HOA disputes, discussed upcoming community projects, and gradually began to voice frustrations that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. "Remember when Karen tried to ban basketball hoops?" said Jack Henderson, nursing his second cup of cider. "Claimed they were recreational equipment that violated the aesthetic standards." "Or the Great Garden Gnome controversy of 2019, added Carol Williams. 3-hour emergency meeting because someone's ceramic frog was supposedly visible from the street. "What about the Christmas decoration deadline?" Martha Peterson's voice carried a note of old anger. "January 2 and removal, even for people who celebrate Orthodox Christmas." Made Mrs. Kowalski take down her nativity scene while her relatives were still visiting. I listened as my neighbors cataloged years of petty enforcement, arbitrary rule interpretations, and heavy-handed tactics that had turned their homeowners association into something resembling a suburban police state. But more importantly, I could see them realizing they weren't alone in their frustrations. "The thing is," said Linda Chen, "most of these rules aren't even in the original covenants. Karen's been adding clarifications and interpretive guidelines for years, and we've just been accepting them because fighting seemed harder than complying." "What if we didn't accept them?" asked a voice from the back of the group. Everyone turned to look at Frank Williams, who'd surprised everyone by returning from his business trip early specifically to attend this gathering. I mean, what if we actually read the covenants and held the HOA board accountable to what's actually written instead of whatever Karen decides they mean this week? The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, visible, substantial, and carrying the scent of something that could spread quickly under the right conditions. The original covenants are pretty reasonable, Carol Williams said thoughtfully. Basic stuff about property maintenance, noise levels, and keeping up appearances. Most of the problematic restrictions have been add-ons from the past few years. So what are you suggesting? Bob Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Frank looked around the group, making eye contact with neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up individually but were finding strength in numbers. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time for some new leadership on the HOA board. People who see their role as serving the community rather than ruling it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering, but before anyone could respond, the sound of high heels clicking on concrete announced Karen's arrival. She appeared at the edge of my property line, like a storm cloud in designer clothing, her face tight with a kind of controlled fury that suggested she'd been watching the proceedings from her bedroom window. In her hand was what looked like another legal document, and her entire posture radiated the confidence of someone about to